Chapter 49 of Red Pottage by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 49. The mouse fell from the ceiling and the cat cried, Allah. Syrian proverb. That help should come through such a recognised channel as a bishop could surprise no one, least of all Lady Newhaven, who had had the greatest faith in the clergy all her life, but nevertheless so overwhelmed was she by despair and its physical sensations that she very nearly refused to see the bishop when he called. Her faith, even in lawn sleeves, momentarily tottered. Who would show her any good? Poor Lady Newhaven was crushed into a state of prostration so frightful that we must not blame her if she felt that even an archbishop would have been powerless to help her. She had thought, after the engagement was announced, of rushing up to London and insisting on seeing Hugh. But always, after she had looked out the trains, her courage had shrunk back at the last moment. There had been a look on Hugh's face during that last momentary meeting which she could not nerve herself to see again. She had been to London already once to see him, without success. She knew Rachel was at the palace at Southminster nursing Hester, and twice she had ordered the carriage to drive over to see her and make a desperate appeal to her to give up Hugh. But she knew that she should fail, and Rachel would triumph over her. Women always did over a defeated rival. Lady Newhaven had not gone. The frightful injustice of it all wrung Lady Newhaven's heart to the point of agony. To see her own property deliberately stolen from her in the light of day, as it were, in the very market-place, before everybody, without being able to raise a finger to regain him. It was intolerable. For she loved Hugh as far as she was capable of loving anything, and her mind had grown round to the idea that he was hers as entirely as a tree will grow round a nail fastened into it. And now he was to marry Rachel, and soon. Let no one think they know pain until they know jealousy. But when the bishop sent up a second time asking to see her on business, she consented. It was too soon to see callers, of course, but a bishop was different. And how could she refuse to admit him when she had admitted that odious Captain Pratt only 4 days before? She hoped no one would become aware of that fact. It was as well for her that she could not hear the remarks of Selina and Ada Pratt as they skated on the frozen meadows with half, not the better half, of Middleshire. Poor Vi Newhaven! Yes, she won't see a creature. She saw Algy for a few minutes last week, but then he is an old friend and does not count. He said she was quite heartbroken. He was quite upset himself. He was so fond of Ted Newhaven. The bishop would not even sit down. He said he was on his way to a confirmation, and added that he had been entrusted with a letter for her, and held it towards her. "It is my husband's handwriting," she said, drawing back with instinctive fear. "It is from your husband," said the bishop gently, softening somewhat at the sight of the ravages which despair had made in the lovely face since he had last seen it. "He asked me to give it into your own hand a month after his death." "Then he told you that—" "He told me nothing, and I wish to hear nothing." "I should like to confess all to you, to feel myself absolved," said Lady Newhaven in a low voice, the letter in her trembling hand. He looked at her, and he saw that she would not say all. She had arranged details to suit herself, and would omit the main point altogether, whatever it might be, if, as if it were more than probable, it told against herself. He would at least save her from the hypocrisy of a half-confession. "If in a month's time you wish to make a full confession to me," he said, "I will hear it. But I solemnly charge you in the meanwhile to speak to no one of this difficulty between you and your husband. Whatever it may have been, it is past. If he sinned against you, he is dead, and the least you can do is to keep silence. If you wronged him—" Lady Newhaven shook her head vehemently. "If you wronged him," repeated the bishop, his face hardening, "be silent for the sake of the children. It is the only miserable reparation you can make him." "You don't understand," she said feebly. I know that he was a kindly, gentle-natured man, and that he died a hard and a bitter one," said the bishop. "God knows what is in that letter, but your husband said it would be of the greatest comfort and assistance to you in a difficulty which he foresaw for you. I will leave you to read it." And he left the room. The early December twilight was creeping over everything. Lady Newhaven took the letter to the window, and after several futile attempts succeeded in opening it. It ran as follows: "It is irreligious to mourn too long for the dead. I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." Second Book of Samuel, chapter 12, verse 23. "In the meanwhile, until you rejoin me, I trust you will remember that it is my especial wish that you should allow one who is in every way worthy of you to console you for my loss, which will make you as happy as you both deserve to be. That I die by my own hand, you and your so-called friend, Miss West, are of course aware. That the one love of your life drew the short lighter, you are perhaps not aware. I waited 2 days to see if he would fulfil the compact, and as he did not, I never thought he would, I retired in his place. I present to you this small piece of information as a wedding present, which, if adroitly handled, may add to the harmony of domestic life. And if by any chance he should have conceived the dastardly, the immoral idea of deserting you in favour of some mercenary marriage, of which I rather suspect him, you will find this piece of information invaluable in restoring his allegiance at once. He is yours by every sacred tie, and no treacherous female friend must wrest him from you. Your late husband, Newhaven." Lady Newhaven put the letter in her pocket, and then fainted away with her fair head on the window ledge. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Red Pottage by Mary Chumley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 50. There cannot be a pinch in death more sharp than this. The bishop's sister, Miss Keene, whose life was a perpetual orgy of mothers' meetings and GFS gatherings, was holding a district visitors' working party in the drawing-room of the palace. The ladies knitted and stitched, while one of their number heaped fuel on the flame of their enthusiasm by reading aloud the History of the Diocese of Southminster. Miss Keene took but little heed of the presence of Rachel and Hester in her brother's house. Those who work mechanically on fixed lines seem, as a rule, to miss the pith of life. She was kind when she remembered them, but her heart was where her treasure was, namely, in her escritoire, with her list of Bible classes and servants' choral unions, and the long roll of contributors to the Guild of Work which she herself had started. When she had been up to Hester's room, invariably at hours when Hester could not see her, and when she had entered Rachel's sledgehammer subscriptions in her various account books, her attention left her visitors. She considered them superficial, and wondered how it was that her brother could find time to spend hours talking to both of them, while he had rarely a moment in which to address her chosen band in the drawing-room. She was one of those persons who find life a very prosaic affair, quite unlike the fiction she occasionally read. She often remarked that nothing except the commonplace happened. Certainly she never observed anything else. So Hester lay in the room above, halting feebly between two opinions, whether to live or to die, and Rachel sat in the bishop's study beneath, waiting to make tea for him on his return from the confirmation. If she did not make it, no one else did. Instead of ringing for it, he went without it. Rachel watched the sun set, a red ball dropping down a frosty sky. It was the last day of the year. The new year was bringing her everything. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said, looking at the last rim of the sun as he sank. And she remembered other years when she had watched the sun set on the last day of December, when life had been difficult. How difficult! "If Hester could only get better, I should have nothing left to wish for," she said. and she prayed the more fervently for her friend, because she knew that even if Hester died, life would still remain beautiful. The future without her would still be flooded with happiness. "A year ago, if Hester had died, I should have had nothing left to live for," she said to herself. "Now this newcomer, this man whom I have known barely 6 months, fills my whole life. Are other women as narrow as I am? Can they care only for one person at a time, like me? Ah, Hester, forgive me, I can't help it." Hugh was coming in presently. He had been in that morning, and the bishop had met him, and had asked him to come in again to tea. Rachel did not know what the bishop thought of him, but he had managed to see a good deal of Hugh. Rachel waited as impatiently as most of us, when our happiness lingers by us, loath to depart. At last she heard the footman bringing someone across the hall. Would Hugh's coming ever become a common thing? Would she ever be able to greet him without this tumult of emotion, ever be able to take his hand without turning giddy on the sheer verge of bliss? The servant announced, "Lady Newhaven." The two women stood looking at each other. Rachel saw the marks of suffering on the white face, and her own became as white. Her eyes fell guiltily before Lady Newhaven's. "Forgive me," she said. "Forgive you?" said Lady Newhaven in a hoarse voice. "It is no use asking me for forgiveness." "You are right," said Rachel, recovering herself and meeting Lady Newhaven's eyes fully. "But what is the use of coming here to abuse me? You might have spared yourself and me this, at least. It will only exhaust you and wound me." "You must give him up," said Lady Newhaven, her hand fumbling under her crape cloak. "I've come to tell you that you must let him go." The fact that Hugh had drawn the short lighter, and had not taken the consequences, did not affect Lady Newhaven's feelings towards him in the least, but she was vaguely aware that somehow it would affect Rachel's, and now it would be Rachel's turn to suffer. Rachel paused a moment, and then said slowly, "He does not wish to be let go." "He is mine." "He was yours once," said Rachel, her face turning from white to grey. That wound was long in healing. "But he is mine now." "Rachel, you cannot be bad all through." Lady Newhaven was putting the constraint upon herself which that tightly clutched paper, that poisonous weapon in reserve, enabled her to assume. For Hugh's sake she would only use it if other means failed. "You must know that you ought to look upon him as a married man. Don't you see," wildly, "that we must marry to put right what was wrong? He owes it to me. People always do." "Yes, they generally do," said Rachel. "But I don't see how it makes the wrong right." "I look upon Hugh as my husband," said Lady Newhaven. "So do I." "Rachel, he loves me. He is only marrying you for your money." "I will risk that." "I implore you on my knees to give him back to me." And Lady Newhaven knelt down with bare, white, outstretched hands. Tableau No. 1, New Series. Rachel shrank back involuntarily. "Listen, Violet," she said, "and get up. I will not speak until you get up." Lady Newhaven obeyed. "If I gave back Hugh to you 100 times, it would not make him love you any more, or make him marry you. I am not keeping him from you. This marriage is his own doing." "Oh, Violet, I'm not young and pretty. I've no illusions about myself. But I believe he really does love me, in spite of that. And I know I love him." "I don't believe it," said Lady Newhaven. "I mean about him, not about you, of course." "Here he is. Let him decide," said Rachel. Hugh came in unannounced. Upon his grave face there was that concentrated look of happiness which has settled in the very deep of the heart and gleams up into the eyes. His face changed painfully. He glanced from one woman to the other. Rachel was sorry for him. She would fain have spared him, but she could not. "Hugh," she said gently, her steadfast eyes resting on him. "Lady Newhaven and I were talking of you. I think it would be best if she heard from your own lips what she naturally will not believe from mine." "I will never believe," said Lady Newhaven, "that you will desert me now, that all the past is nothing to you, and that you will cast me aside for another woman." Hugh looked at her steadily. Then he went up to Rachel, and, taking her hand, raised it to his lips. There was in his manner a boundless, reverent adoration that was to Lady Newhaven's jealousy as a match to gunpowder. Rachel kept his hand. "Are you sure you want him, Rachel?" gasped Lady Newhaven, holding convulsively to a chair for support. "He has cast me aside. He will cast you aside next, for he is a coward and a traitor. Are you sure you want to marry him? His hands are red with blood. He murdered my husband." Rachel's hand tightened on Hugh's. "It was an even chance," she said. "Those who draw lots must abide by the drawing." "It was an even chance!" shrieked Lady Newhaven. "But who drew the short lighter? Tell me that. Who refused to fulfil his part when the time was up? Tell me that." "You are mad," said Rachel. "I can prove it," said Lady Newhaven, holding out the letter in her shaking hands. "You may read it, Rachel. I can trust you. Not him. He would burn it. It is from Edward. Look, you know his writing, written to tell me that he," pointing at Hugh, "had drawn the short lighter, but that, as he had not killed himself when the time came, he, Edward, did so instead. That was why he was late. We always wondered, Rachel, why he was 2 days late. Read it! Read it!" "I will not read it," said Rachel, pushing away the paper. "I do not believe a word of it." "You shall believe it. Ask him to deny it if he can." "You need not trouble to deny it," said Rachel, looking full at Hugh. The world held only her and him, and as Hugh looked into her eyes his soul rose up and scaled the heights above it till he stood beside hers. There is a sacred place where, if we follow close in love's footsteps, we see him lay aside his earthly quiver and his bitter arrows, and turn to us as he is, with the light of God upon him, one with us as one with God. In that pure light lies ceased to be. We know them no more, neither remember them, for love and truth are one. Hugh strode across to Lady Newhaven, took the letter from her, and threw it into the heart of the fire. Then he turned to Rachel. "I drew the short lighter," he said. "I meant to take the consequences at first, but when the time came, I did not. Partly I was afraid, and partly I could not leave you." If Lady Newhaven yearned for revenge, she had it then. They had both forgotten her. But she saw Rachel's eyes change, as the eyes of a man at the stake might change when the fire reached him. She shrank back from the agony in them. Hugh's face became pinched and thin as a dead man's. A moment ago he saw no consequences. He saw only that he could not lie to her. His mind fell headlong from its momentary foothold. What mad impulse had betrayed him to his ruin? "You drew the short lighter, and you let me think all the time he had," said Rachel, her voice almost inaudible in its fierce passion. "You drew it, and you let him die instead of you, as anyone who knew him would know he would. And when he was dead, you came to me and kept me in ignorance even that time when I said I trusted you." The remembrance of that meeting was too much. Rachel turned her eyes on Lady Newhaven, who was watching her, terror-stricken. "I said I would not give him up, but I will," she said violently. "You can take him if you want him. What was it you said to me, Hugh? That if you had drawn the short lighter you would have had to abide by it. Yes, that was it. Your whole intercourse with me has been one lie from first to last. You were right, Violet, when you said he ought to marry you. It would be another lie on the top of all the others." "It is what Edward wished," faltered his widow. "He says so in the letter that has just been burned." Lord Newhaven wished it, said Rachel, looking at the miserable man between them. Poor Lord Newhaven. First his honour, then his life. You have taken everything he had, but there are still his shoes. Rachel, said Hugh suddenly, and he fell on his knees before her, clasping the hem of her gown. She pushed him violently from her, tearing her gown and releasing it from his frenzied grasp. Leave me, she whispered. Her voice was almost gone. Coward and liar, I will have nothing more to do with you. He got upon his feet somehow. The two grey, desperate faces, spent with passion, faced each other. They were past speech. He read his death warrant in her merciless eyes. She looked at the despair in his, without flinching. He stood a moment, and then, feeling his way like one half-blind, left the room, unconsciously pushing aside Lady Newhaven, whom both had forgotten. She gave one terrified glance at Rachel, and slipped out after him. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Red Pottage by Mary Chumley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 51. I thought, now, if I had been a woman such as God made women, to save men by love, by just my love I might have saved this man. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Has Lady Newhaven been here? Said the bishop, coming into the study, his hands full of papers. I thought I saw her carriage driving away as I came up. She has been here. The bishop looked up suddenly, his attention arrested by Rachel's voice. There is a white heat of anger that mimics the pallor of a fainting fit. The bishop thought that she was about to swoon, until he saw her eyes. Those gentle, faithful eyes were burning. He shrank as one who sees the glare of fire raging inside familiar windows. My poor child, he said, and he sat down heavily in his leather armchair. Rachel still stood. She looked at him, and her lips moved, but no sound came forth. The bishop looked intently at her. "Where is Scarlet?" he said. Hugh is gone," she said, stammering. "I have broken off my engagement with him. He will never come back." And she fell suddenly on her knees, and hid her convulsed face against the arm of a chair. The bishop did not move. He waited for this paroxysm of anger to subside. He had never seen Rachel angry before in all the years he had known her, but he watched her without surprise. Only stupid people think that coal cannot burn as fiercely as tow. She remained a long time on her knees, her face hidden. The bishop did not hurry her. At last she began to sob silently, shuddering from head to foot. Then he came and sat down near her, and took the cold, clinched hands in his. "Rachel, tell me," he said gently. She tried to pull her hands away, but he held them firmly. He obliged her to look up at him. She raised her fierce, disfigured face for a moment, and then let it fall on his hands and hers. "I am a wicked woman," she said. "Don't trouble about me. I am not worth it. I thought I would have kept all suffering from him, but now, if I could make him suffer, I would. I have no doubt he is suffering. Not enough, not like me. And I loved him and trusted him. And he is false too, like that other man I loved. Like you, only I have not found you out yet. Like Hester, like all the rest. I will never trust anyone again. I will never be deceived again. This is the second time." And Rachel broke into a passion of tears. The bishop released her hands and felt for his own handkerchief. Then he waited, praying silently. The clock had made a long circuit before she raised herself. "I am very selfish," she said, looking with compunction at the kind, tired face. "I ought to have gone to my room instead of breaking down here. Dear bishop, forgive me. It is past now. I shall not give way again." "Will you make me some tea?" he said. She made the tea with shaking hands and awkward, half-blind movements. It was close on dinner time, but she did not notice it. He obliged her to drink some, and then he settled himself in his leather armchair. He went over his engagements for the evening. In half an hour he ought to be dining with Canon Glynn to meet an old college friend. At 11 he had arranged to see a young clergyman whose conscience was harrying him. He wrote a note on his knee without moving, saying he could not come, and touched the bell at his elbow. When the servant had taken the note, he relapsed into the depths of his armchair and sipped his tea. "I think, Rachel," he said at last, "that I ought to tell you that I partly guess at your reason for breaking off your engagement. I have known for some time that there was trouble between the Newhavens. From what Lady Newhaven said to me today, and from the fact that she has been here, and that immediately after seeing her you broke your engagement with Scarlett, I must come to the conclusion that Scarlett has been the cause of this trouble." Rachel had regained her composure. Her face was white and hard. "You are right," she said. "He was at one time her lover." "And you consider in consequence that he is unfit to become your husband?" "No. He told me about it before he asked me to marry him. I accepted him, knowing it." "Then he was trying to retrieve himself. He acted towards you, at any rate, like an honourable man." Rachel laughed. "So I thought at the time." "If you accepted him, knowing about his past, I don't see why you should have thrown him over. One dishonourable action, sincerely repented, does not make a dishonourable man." "I did not know all," said Rachel. "I do now." The bishop looked into the fire. Her next words surprised him. "You really cared for Lord Newhaven, did you not?" "I did." "Then, as you know the one thing he risked his life to conceal for the sake of his children, namely his wife's misconduct, I think I had better tell you the rest." So Rachel told him in harsh, bald language the story of the drawing of lots, and how she and Lady Newhaven had remained ignorant as to which had drawn the short lighter. How Hugh had drawn it, how when the time came he had failed to fulfil the agreement, how 2 days later Lord Newhaven had killed himself, and how she and Lady Newhaven had both, of course, concluded that Lord Newhaven must have drawn the short lighter. Rachel went on, her hard voice shaking a little. "Hugh had told me that he had had an entanglement with a married woman. I knew it long before he spoke of it, but just because he risked losing me by owning it, I loved and trusted him all the more. I thought he was, at any rate, an upright man. After Lord Newhaven's death he asked me to marry him, and I accepted him. And when we were talking quietly one day—" Rachel's face became, if possible, whiter than before. "I told him that I knew of the drawing of lots. He thought no one knew of it except the dead man and himself. And I told him that he must not blame himself for Lord Newhaven's death. He had brought it on himself. I said to him—" Rachel's voice trembled more and more. "It was an even chance. You might have drawn the short lighter yourself. And he said that if he had, he should have had to abide by it." The bishop shaded his eyes with his hand. It seemed cruel to look at Rachel, as it is cruel to watch a man drown. "And how do you know he did draw it?" he said. "It seems Lord Newhaven left his wife a letter which she has only just received, telling her so. She brought it here today to show me." "Ah, a letter, and you read it?" "No," said Rachel scornfully, "I did not read it. I did not believe a word she said about it. Hugh was there, and I told him I trusted him, and he took the letter from her and put it in the fire." "And did he not contradict it?" "No, he said it was true. He had lied to me over and over again, but I saw he was speaking the truth for once." There was a long silence. "I don't know how other people regard these things," said Rachel at last, less harshly. She was gradually recovering herself. "But I know to me it was much worse that he could deceive me than that he should have been Lady Newhaven's lover. I did feel that dreadfully. I had to choke down my jealousy when he kissed me. He had kissed her first. He had made that side of his love common and profane. But the other side remained. I clung to that. I believed he really loved me, and that supported me and enabled me to forgive him, though men don't know what that forgiveness costs us. Only the walls of our rooms know that. But it seems to me much worse to have failed me on that other side as well, to have deceived me, to have told me a lie just when we were talking intimately. It was infinitely worse, said the bishop. And it was the action of a coward to draw lots in the first instance, if he did not mean to abide by the drawing, and the action of a traitor, once they were drawn, not to abide by them. But yet, if he had only told me the whole truth, I loved him so entirely that I would have forgiven even that. But whenever I alluded to it, he lied. He was afraid of losing you. He has lost me by his deceit. He would not have lost me if he had told me the truth. I know that I could have got over anything, forgiven anything, even his cowardice, if he had only admitted it and been straightforward with me. A little plain dealing was all I asked, but I did not get it. The bishop looked sadly at her. Straightforwardness is so seldom the first requirement a woman makes of the man she loves. Women, as a rule, regard men and their conduct only from the point of view of their relation to women, as sons, as husbands, as fathers. Yet Rachel, it seemed, could forgive Hugh's sin against her as a woman, but not his further sin against her as a friend. Yet it seems he did speak the truth at last, he said. Yes, and after he had destroyed the letter, which was the only proof against him. Yes. Another silence. I am glad you have thrown him over, said the bishop slowly, for you never loved him. I deceived myself in that case, said Rachel bitterly. My only fear was that I loved him too much. The bishop's face had become fixed and stern. Listen to me, Rachel, he said. You fell desperately in love with an inferior man. He is charming, refined, well-bred, and with a picturesque mind, but that is all. He is inferior. He is by nature shallow and hard. The two generally go together. Without moral backbone. The kind of man who never faces a difficulty, who always flinches when it comes to the point. The stuff out of which liars and cowards are made. His one redeeming quality is his love for you. I have seen men in love before. I have never seen a man care more for a woman than he cares for you. His love for you has taken entire possession of him, and by it he will sink or swim. The bishop paused. Rachel's face worked. He deceived you, said the bishop, not because he wished to deceive you, but because he was in a horrible position, and because his first impulse of love was to keep you at any price. But his love for you was raising him even while he deceived you. Did he spend sleepless nights because for months he vilely deceived Lord Newhaven? No. Rectitude was not in him. His conscience was not awake. But I tell you, Rachel, he has suffered like a man on the rack from deceiving you. I knew by his face as soon as I saw him that he was undergoing some great mental strain. I did not understand it, but I do now. Rachel's mind, always slow, moved, stumbled to its bleeding feet. It was remorse, she said, turning her face away. It was not remorse, it was repentance. Remorse is bitter, repentance is humble. His love for you has led him to it. Not your love for him, Rachel, which breaks down at the critical moment. His love for you, which has brought him for the first time to the perception of the higher life, to the need of God's forgiveness, which I know from things he has said has made him long to lead a better life, one worthier of you. Don't, said Rachel. I can't bear it. The bishop rose and stood facing her. And at last, he went on, at last, in a moment, when you showed your full trust and confidence in him, he shook off for an instant the clogs of the nature which he brought into the world, and rose to what he had never been before, your equal. And his love transcended the lies that love itself on its lower plane had prompted. he reached the place where he could no longer lie to you. And then, though his whole future happiness depended on one more lie, he spoke the truth. Rachel put out her hand as if to ward off what was coming. "And how did you meet him the first time he spoke the truth to you?" continued the bishop, inexorably. "You say you loved him, and yet you spurned him from you. You thrust him down into hell. You stooped to him in the beginning. He was nothing until your fancied love fell upon him. And then you break him. It is women like you who do more harm in the world than the bad ones. The harm that poor fool Lady Newhaven did him is as nothing compared to the harm you have done him. You were his god, and you have deserted him, and you say you loved him. May God preserve men from the love of women, if that is all that a good woman's love is capable of." "I can do nothing," said Rachel hoarsely. "Do nothing?" said the bishop fiercely. "You can do nothing when you are responsible for a man's soul. God will require his soul at your hands. Scarlet gave it into your keeping, and you took it. You had no business to take it if you meant to throw it away, and now you say you can do nothing." "What can I do?" said Rachel faintly. "Forgive him." "Forgiveness won't help him. The only forgiveness he would care for is to marry me." "Of course. It is the only way you can forgive him." Rachel turned away. Her stubborn, quivering face showed a frightful conflict. The bishop watched her. "My child," he said gently, "we all say we follow Christ, but most of us only follow him and his cross part of the way. When we are told that our Lord bore our sins and was wounded for our transgressions, I suppose that meant that he felt as if they were his own in his great love for us. But when you shrink from bearing your fellow creatures' transgressions, it shows that your love is small." Rachel was silent. "If you really love him, you will forgive him." Rachel clinched and unclinched her hands. "You are appealing to a nobility and goodness which are not in me," she said stubbornly. "I appeal to nothing but your love. If you really love him, you will forgive him." "He has broken my heart." "I thought that was it. It is yourself you are thinking of. But what is he suffering at this moment? You do not know or care. Where is he now, that poor man who loves you? Rachel, if you have ever known despair, you would not thrust a fellow creature down into it." "I have known it," said Rachel hoarsely. "Were not you deserted once? You were deserted to very little purpose, if after that you can desert another. Go back in your mind, and remember. Where you stood once, he stands now. You and his sin have put him there. You and his sin have tied him to his stake. Will you range yourself forever on the side of his sin? Will you stand by and see him perish?" Silence, like the silence round a deathbed. "He is in a great strait. Only love can save him." Rachel flung out her arms with an inarticulate cry. "I will forgive him," she said. "I will forgive him." End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Red Pottage by Mary Chumley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Les armes dont j'aurais besoin et les étoiles sont trop longs. Je mourrai dans un coin. How Hugh shook off Lady Newhaven when she followed him out of the palace, he did not know. There had been some difficulty. She had spoken to him, had urged something upon him. But he had got rid of her somehow, and had found himself sitting in his bedroom at the Southminster Hotel. Anything to be alone. He had felt that that was the one thing in life to attain. But now that he was alone, solitude suddenly took monstrous and hideous proportions, and became a horror to flee from. He could not bear the face of a fellow creature. He could not bear this ghoul of solitude. There was no room for him between these two great millstones. They pressed upon him till he felt they were crushing him to death between them. In vain he endeavoured to compose himself, to recollect himself. But exhaustion gradually did for him what he could not do for himself. Rachel had thrown him over. He had always known she would, and she had. They were to have been married in a few weeks, 3 weeks and 1 day. He marked a day off every morning when he waked. He had thought of her as his wife till the thought had become part of himself. Its roots were in his inmost being. He tore it out now, and looked at it apart from himself, as a man bleeding and shuddering looks upon a dismembered limb. The sweat broke from Hugh's forehead. The waiting and daily parting had seemed unbearable, that short waiting of a few weeks. Now she would never be his. That long, ever-growing hunger of the heart would never be appeased. She had taken herself away, taking away with her her dear hands and her faithful eyes and the low voice, the very sound of which brought comfort and peace. They were his hands and eyes. She had given them to him. And now she had wrenched them away again. Those faithful eyes had seared him with their scorn. Those white hands, against which he had leaned his forehead, had thrust him violently from her. He could not live without her. This was death, to be parted from her. "I can't, Rachel, I can't," said Hugh, over and over again. What was any lesser death compared to this, compared to her contempt? She would never come back. She despised him. She would never love him any more. He had told her that it must be a dream that she could love him, and that he should wake. And she had said it was all quite true. How sweetly she had said it. But it was a dream after all, and he had waked, in torment. Life, as long as he lived, would be like this moment. "I will not bear it," he said suddenly, with the frantic instinct of escape which makes a man climb out of a burning house over a window ledge. Far down is the pavement, quiet, impassive, deadly, but behind is the blast of the furnace. Panic staggers between the two, and jumps. "I will not bear it," said Hugh, tears of anguish welling up into his eyes. He had not only lost her, but he had lost himself. That better, humble, earnest self had gone away with Rachel, and he was thrust back on the old, false, cowardly self, whom, since she had loved him, he had abhorred. He had disowned it, he had cast it off. Now it enveloped him again, like a shirt of fire, and a voice within him said, "This is the real you. You deceived yourself for a moment, but this is the real you, the liar, the coward, the traitor, who will live with you again forever." "I am forsaken," said Hugh. He repeated the words over and over again. "Forsaken, forsaken." And he looked round for a way of escape. Somewhere in the back of his mind a picture hung, which he had seen once and never looked at again. He turned and looked at it now, as a man turns and looks at a picture on the wall behind him. He saw it again, the still upturned face of the little lake among its encircling trees, as he had seen it that day when he and Doll came suddenly upon it in the woods. What had it to do with him? He had escaped from it once. He understood now. Who that had once seen it had ever forgotten it, the look that deep water takes when life is unbearable? "Come down to me among my tall water plants," it says. "I am a refuge, a way of escape. This horror and nightmare of life cannot reach you in my bosom. Come down to me. I promise nothing but to lay my cool hand upon the fire in your brain, and that the world shall release its clutch upon you. The world which promises and will not keep its promises. I will keep mine." Hugh's mind wavered as the flame of a candle wavers in a sudden draught. So had it wavered once in the fear of death, and he had yielded to that fear. So it wavered now with a greater fear, the fear of life, and he yielded to that fare. He caught out his hat and went out. It was dark, and he hit against the people in the feebly lighted streets as he hurried past. How hot it was! How absurd to see those gathered heaps of snow and the muffled figures of men and women! Presently he had left the town and was in the open country. Where was he going along this interminable road in this dim snow light? The night was very still. The spirit of the frost stooped over the white face of the earth. The long homely lines of meadow and wold and hedgerow showed like the austere folds of a shroud. Hugh walked swiftly, looking neither to right nor left. The fire in his brain mounted. The moon, entangled in a dim thicket, got up behind him. At last he stopped short. That farm on the right, he'd seen it before. Yes, that was Greenfields. Doll had pointed it out to him when they walked on that Sunday afternoon to Beaumere. They had left the road here and had taken to the fields. There was the gate. Hugh opened it. Crack had been lost here and had rejoined them in the wood. The field was empty. A path like a crease ran across it. He knew the way. It was the only way of escape from this shadow in front of him, this other self who had come back to him and torn Rachel from him and made her hate him. She loved him really. She was faithful. She would never have forsaken him. But she had mistaken this evil, creeping shadow for him, and he had not been able to explain. But she would understand presently. He would make it all very clear and plain, and she would love him again when he had got rid of this other Hugh. He would take him down and drown him in Beaumere. It was the only way to get rid of him, and he, the real Hugh, would get safely through. He had done it once, and he knew. He should stifle and struggle for a little while. There was a turn exceeding sharp to be passed, but he should reach that place of peace beyond, as he had done before, and find Rachel waiting for him, her arms round him again. "It is the only way," he said over and over again. "The only way." He reached the wood. The moon was up now, and smote white and sharp down the long winding aisle of the cathedral, which God builds him in every forest glade, where the hoar-frost and the snow held now their solemn service of praise. Hugh saw the little light of the keeper's cottage, and instinctively edged his way to the left. He was pressed for time. A wheel was turning in his head so quickly in this great heat, that unless he were quicker than it would outdistance him altogether. At last he saw the water, and ran down swiftly towards it. The white tree trunks were in league against him, and waylaid him, striking him violently. But he struck back, and got through them. They fell behind at last. His shadow was beside him now, short and nimble. He looked round once or twice to make sure it was still with him. He reached the water's edge, and then stopped short, aghast. Where was the water gone? It had deceived him and deserted him like everything else. It was all hard as iron, one great white sheet of ice stretching away in front of him. He had thought of the little lake as he had last seen it, cool and deep, and with the shadows of the summer trees in it. It was all changed and gone. There was no help here. The way of escape was closed. With a hoarse cry he set off, running across the ice in the direction of the place where he had nearly drowned before. It was here, opposite that clump of silver birch. The ice was a different colour here. It tilted and creaked suddenly beneath his feet. He flung himself down upon it and struck it wildly with his fist. "Let me through," he stammered. But the ice resisted him. It made an ominous dry crackling, as if in mockery. It barely resisted him, but it did resist him, and he had no time. He scrambled to his feet again, and it gave way instantly. The other self pounced suddenly upon him and came through with him, and they struggled furiously together in deep water. I must, gasped Hugh between his clenched teeth. "You shall not," said the other self, mad with terror. "Hold on to the ice." Hugh saw his bleeding hands holding tightly to the jagged edge. It broke. He clutched another piece. It broke again. The current was sucking him slowly under the ice. The broken pieces pushed him. One arm was under already, and he could not get it out. The animal horror of a trap seized him. He had not known it would be like this. He was not prepared for this. The other self fought furiously for life, clutching and tearing at the breaking ice. "Call," it said to him, "while there is still time." Hugh set his teeth. The ice broke in a great piece and tilted heavily against him. It was over one shoulder. "Call," said the other self sharply again, "or you will be under the ice." And up to the quiet heaven rose once and again a hoarse, wild cry of human agony and despair. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Red Pottage by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 53. Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe, in allen Wipfeln spürst du. Kaum einen Hauch, die Vogelein schweigen im Walde. Warte nur balde, wo hast du auch? Goethe. The doctor was very late. Rachel, who was going to the watch service, waited for the bishop in the hall till he came out of his study with the curate, who had doubts. When the young man had left, Rachel said, hesitating, "I shall not go to the service if Dr. Brown does not arrive before then. Hugh was to have come with us. I don't want him to go all through the night thinking, perhaps if I am prevented going, you will see him and speak a word to him." "My dear," said the bishop, "I went across to his rooms 2 hours ago directly you went up to Hester." He loved Rachel, but he wondered at her lack of imagination. "2 hours ago? And what did you say to him?" "I did not see him. I was too late. He was gone." "Gone?" said Rachel faintly. "Where?" "I do not know. I went up to his rooms. All his things were still there." "Where is he now?" "I do not know." The bishop looked at her compassionately. She had been a long time forgiving him. While she hesitated, he had said to her, "Where is he now?" and she had not understood. Her face became pinched and livid. She understood now, after the event. "I am frightened for him," she said. The bishop had been alarmed while she poured out his tea before they began to talk. "Perhaps he has gone back to London," she said, her eyes widening with a vague dread. The bishop had gone on to the station and had ascertained that Hugh had not left by the one train which had stopped at Southminster between 7 and 9, but he did not add to her anxiety by saying so. The doctor's brougham, coming at full speed, drew up suddenly at the door. "There he is at last," said the bishop, and before the bell could be rung he opened the door. A figure was already on the threshold, but it was not Dr. Brown. It was Dick. "Where is Dr. Brown?" said Rachel and the bishop simultaneously, looking at the doctor's well-known brougham and smoking horses. "He asked me to come," said Dick, measuring Rachel with his eye. Then he did as he would be done by, and added slowly, "He was kept. He was on his way here from Wilderley, where one of the servants is ill, and as I was dining there he offered me a lift back. And when we were passing that farm near the wood, a man stopped us. He said there had been an accident. Someone nearly drowned. I went too. It turned out to be Scarlet. Dr. Brown remained with him and sent me to take you to him." "Is he dead?" asked Rachel, her eyes never leaving Dick's face. "No, but he is very ill." "I will come now." The chaplain came slowly across the hall, laden with books and papers. "Let Canon Seabright know at once that I cannot take part in the service," said the bishop sharply, and he hurried down the steps after Rachel and got into the carriage with her. Dick turned up the collar of his fur coat and climbed up beside the coachman. The carriage turned warily and then set off at a great pace. The cathedral loomed up suddenly, all aglow with light within. Out into the night came the dirge of the organ for the dying year. The bishop kept his eyes fixed on the pane. The houses were left behind. They were in the country. "Who is that?" said Rachel suddenly, as a long shadow ran beside them along the white hedgerow. "It's only Dick. There is a rise on the ground here, and he is running to ease the horses." There was a long silence. "I believe he did it on purpose," said Rachel at last. "I forsook him in his great need, and now he has forsaken me." "He would never forsake you, Rachel." "Not knowingly," she said. "I did it knowing. That is the difference between him and me." She did not speak again. For a lifetime, as it seemed to the bishop, the carriage swayed from side to side of the white road. At last, when he had given up all hope, it turned into a field and jolted heavily over the frozen ruts. Then it came to a standstill. Rachel was out of the carriage before Dick could get off the box. She looked at him without speaking, and he led the way swiftly through the silent wood under the moon. The bishop followed. The keeper's cottage had a dim yellow glimmer in it. Man's little light looked like a kind of darkness in the great, white, all-pervading splendour of the night. The cottage door was open. Dr. Brown was looking out. Rachel went up to him. "Where is he?" she said. He tried to speak. He tried to hold her gently back while he explained something. But he saw she was past explanation, blind and deaf, except for one voice, one face. "Where is he?" she repeated, shaking her head impatiently. "Here," said the doctor, and he led her through the kitchen. A man and woman rose up from the fireside as she came in. He opened the door into the little parlour. On the floor, on a mattress, lay a tall figure. The head, supported on a pillow, was turned towards the door. The wide eyes were fixed on the candle on the table. The lips moved continually. The hands were picking at the blankets. For the first moment Rachel did not know him. How could this be Hugh? How could these blank, unrecognizing eyes be Hugh's eyes, which had never until now met hers without love? But it was he. Yes, it was he. She traced the likeness as we do in a man's son to the man himself. She fell on her knees beside him and took the wandering hands and kissed them. He looked at her, through her, with those bright, unseeing eyes, and the burning hands escaped from hers back to their weary work. Dick, whose eyes had followed Rachel, turned away, biting his lip, and sat down in a corner of the kitchen. The keeper and his wife had slipped away into the little scullery. The bishop went up to Dick and put his arm round his shoulders. 2 tears of pain were standing in Dick's hawk eyes. He had seen Rachel kiss Hugh's hands. He ground his heel against the brick floor. The bishop understood, and understood too the sudden revulsion of feeling. "Poor chap," said Dick huskily. "It's frightfully hard luck on him to have to go just when she was to have married him. If it had been me, I could not have borne it. But then I would have taken care I was not drowned. I'd have seen to that. But it's frightfully hard luck on him all the same." "I suppose he was taking a short cut across the ice." "Yes," said Dick, "and he got in where anyone who knew the look of ice would have known he would be sure to get in. The keeper watched him cross the ice. There was some time before they could get near him to get him out, and it seems there is some injury." Dr. Brown came slowly out, half closing the parlour door behind him. "I can do nothing more," he said. "If he lived, he would have brain fever. But he is dying." "Does he know her?" "No. He may know her at the last, but it's doubtful. I can do nothing, and I'm wanted elsewhere." "I will stop," said the bishop. "Shall I take you back?" said Dr. Brown, looking at Dick. But Dick shook his head. "I might be of use to her," he said, when the doctor had gone. So the 2 men who loved Rachel sat in impotent compassion in the little kitchen through the interminable hours of the night. At long intervals the bishop went quietly into the parlour, but apparently he was not wanted there. Once he went out and got a fresh candle and put it into the tin candlestick and set it among the china ornaments on woolwork mats. Hugh lay quite still now, with his eyes half closed. His hands lay passive in Rachel's. The restless fever of movement was past. She almost wished it back, so far was his life ebbing away from hers. "Hughie," she whispered to him over and over again, "I love you. Do not leave me." But he muttered continually to himself and took no heed of her. At last she gave up the hopeless task of making him hear, and listened intently. She could make no sense of what he said. The few words she could catch were repeated 100 times amid an unintelligible murmur. The boat, and Loftus, and her own name, and Crack. Who was Crack? She remembered the little dog which had been drowned. And the lips which were so soon to be silent talked on incoherently, or Rachel's heart broke for a word. The night was wearing very thin. The darkness before the dawn, the deathly chill before the dawn were here. Through the low uncurtained window Rachel could see the first wan light of the new day and of the new year. Perhaps he would know her with the daylight. The new day came up out of the white east in a great peace, pale as Christ newly risen from the dead, with the splendour of God's love upon him. A great peace and light stole together into the little room. Hugh stirred, and Rachel saw a change pass over his pinched, sunken face. "It was the only way to reach her," he said, slowly and distinctly. "The only way. I shall get through, and I shall find her upon the other side, as I did before. It is very cold, but I shall get through. I am nearly through now." He sat up and looked directly at her. He seemed suddenly freed, released. A boyish look that she had never seen came into his face, a look which remained in Rachel's heart while she lived. Would he know her? The pure light was upon his face, more beautiful than she had ever seen it. He looked at her with tender love and trust shining in his eyes, and laughed softly. "I have found you," he said, stretching out his arms towards her. "I lost you, I don't remember how, but I came to you through the water. I knew I should find you, my Rachel, my sweet wife." He was past the place of our poor human forgiveness. He might have cared for it earlier, but he did not want it now. He had forgotten that he had any need of it, for the former things had passed away. Love only remained. She took him in her arms. She held him to her heart. "I knew you would," he said, smiling at her. "I knew it. We will never part again." And with a sigh of perfect happiness, he turned wholly to her, his closed eyes against her breast. End of chapter 53. The conclusion of Red Pottage by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. The conclusion. It was autumn once more. The brambles were red in the hollow below Warpington Vicarage. Abel was gathering the apples in the orchard. Mr. and Mrs. Gressley were sitting together in the shade of the new porch, contemplating a triumphal arch which they had just erected across the road. "Long life and happiness" was the original motto inscribed thereon. Mrs. Gressley, in an alarming new hat, sank back exhausted in her garden chair. "The Pratts are having 6 arches, all done with electric light designs of hearts with their crest on the top," she said. "They are to be lit up at 9 o'clock. Mr. Pratt said he did not mind any expense on such an occasion. He said it made an epoch in the life of the county." "Well," said Mr. Gressley, "I lead too busy a life to be always poking my nose into other people's affairs. But I certainly never did expect that Lady Newhaven would have married Algy Pratt." "Ada and Selina say Algy and she have been attached for years. That is why the wedding is so soon, only 9 months, and she is to keep her title, and they are going to live at Westope. I told Ada and Selina I hoped they did not expect too much from the marriage, for sometimes people who did were disappointed. But they only laughed and said Vi had promised Algy to take them out next season." "We seem to live in an atmosphere of weddings," said Mr. Gressley. "First Dr. Brown and Fraulein, and now Algy Pratt and Lady Newhaven." "I was so dreadfully afraid that Fraulein might think our arch was put up for her and presume upon it," said Mrs. Gressley, "that I thought it better to send her a little note, just to welcome her cordially and tell her how busy we were about the Pratt festivities, and what a coincidence it was her arriving on the same day. I told her I would send down the children to spend the morning with her tomorrow. I knew that would please her, and it is Mrs. Baker's day in Southminster with her aunt, and I shall really be too busy to see after them. In some ways I don't like Miss Baker as much as Fraulein. She's paid just the same, but she does much less. She's really quite short sometimes if I asked her to do any little thing for me, like copying out that church music. Hester used to do it, said Mr. Gressley. Miss Brown told me she'd heard from Hester, and that she and Miss West are still in India, and they mean to go to Australia and New Zealand and come home next spring. Was Hester well? Quite well. You know, James, I always told you that hers was not a genuine illness. That was why they would not let us see her. It was only hysteria, which girls get when they are disappointed at not marrying and are not so young as they were. Directly poor Mr. Scarlett died, Hester left her room and devoted herself to Miss West, and Dr. Brown said it was the saving of her. But for my part, I always thought Hester took in Dr. Brown and the bishop about that illness. I should not wonder if Hester married Dick Vernon, said Mr. Gressley. It is rather marked they're going to Australia when he went back there only a few months ago. If she had consulted me, I should have advised her not to follow him up. A burst of cheering, echoed by piercing howls from Bulu, locked up in the empty nursery. I hope Miss Baker has put the children in a good place. She's sure to be in a good one herself, said Mrs. Gressley, as she and her husband took up their position by the gate. More cheering. A sudden flourish of trumpets and a trombone from the volunteer band at the corner, of which Mr. Pratt was colonel. A clatter of 4 white horses and an open carriage. A fleeting vision of Captain Pratt, white waistcoat, smile, teeth, eyeglass, hat waved in lavender kid hand. A fleeting vision of a lovely woman in white, with a wonderful white feathered hat and a large diamond heart, possibly a love token from Captain Pratt, hanging on a long diamond chain, bowing and smiling beside her elaborate bridegroom. In a moment they were past, and a report of cannon and field artillery showed that the east lodge of Warpington Towers had been reached, and the solemn joy of the Pratts was finding adequate expression. "You look rather frightened," said Mrs. Gressley. "Such a magnificent reception is alarming to a gentle, retiring nature," said Mr. Gressley. More cheering, this time much more enthusiastic than the last, louder, deafening. Dr. Brown's dog-cart came slowly in sight, accompanied by a crowd. "They have taken out the horse and are dragging them up," said Mrs. Gressley in astonishment. "Look at Dr. Brown waving his hat and Fraulein bowing in that silly way. Well, I only hope her head won't be turned by the arches and everything. She will find my note directly she gets in. Really, James, 2 brides and bridegrooms in one day. It is like the end of a novel." Postscript. We turn the pages of the Book of Life with impatient hands, and if we shut up the book at a sad page, we say hastily, "Life is sad." But it is not so. There are other pages waiting to be turned. I, who have copied out one little chapter of the lives of Rachel and Hester, cannot see plainly, but I catch glimpses of those other pages. I seem to see Rachel with children round her, and Dick not far off, and the old light rekindled in Hester's eyes. For hope and love and enthusiasm never die. We think in youth that we bury them in the graveyards of our hearts, but the grass never yet grew over them. How then can life be sad when they walk beside us always in the growing light towards the perfect day? End of the conclusion. End of Red Pottage by Mary Chumley.